All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Unapologetic Apologist. I'm joined by my good friend Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Mike Jones, how you doing, brother?
Good, how you doing?
Oh, I'm not doing too shabby. So recently you did a video, 10 Biblical Problems for Young Earth Creationism, and mainly what I want to do in this video is I want to be very clear because people might look back over this video, and I'll say it a couple times that I don't necessarily represent the views that I'm going to be espousing. I'm going to be trying to steel man what I think could be good young earth responses to your points here. But I guess real quickly before we get into that, I do have a summary kind of the 10 points here, but without going into all of them, I would say what kind of really inspired you to do this video?
Yeah, so for people who don't know, I made a video, Top 10 Biblical Problems for Young Earth Creationism. And it kind of came from 2 points. One is I'm sick and tired of hearing young earth creationists have a monopoly on the simplest reading of scriptures. They don't. There's a lot of problems in the Bible that they tend to overlook or just ignore that would contradict a young earth view. And so this kind of came about because I went through a Genesis 1 through 11 series where I provided commentary on each chapter. And I finished it up in October. And so I went from going through that series, I noticed there's a lot of problems. So I picked 10 that showed up in the series, and I just put them into one big video where they're all together and people can see all the problems young earth creationism can have from just trying to take a plain reading of scripture.
Yeah, that's real good. And so in this video, we're not going to focus, I guess, too much on Ken Hovind or his responses. We might do that later because I know he's planning on doing more responses to you. But
I hope so. They are so funny because he makes so many errors. But yeah.
Yeah, well, according to him, you can't do basic math. So let's let that be on the record that Mike Jones can't do basic math. No, but one of the things that I got from it, and I think probably the first time you were on my show, we talked about Ken Hovind and how I kind of have a sentimental reaction to him. Years ago, maybe it's almost 10 years now, when I was big on Ken Hovind because I just got into apologetics and all that, and even recently, I've kind of defended him. I've had a tendency to defend him where he got more edgy on parts, like the whole whack and atheist thing. Like I can see how some people look at that and see it as like the opposite of Braxton Hunter, right? It's like an uncharitable response to atheists. But as a fan of comedy, I never want to be. He could use the whole he's been hardened by the prison system, so now he's whacking atheists. Like that's kind of comical to me. So I've been in the habit of defending him on that kind of stuff. But in this video, the way he attacked you, I don't think is defensible. I didn't like it. Like, for him to say that you're, by defending evolution or an old earth, for that you're somehow, on the side of, and I think he used these words like on the side of Satan, like doing something.
He said, "I'm on the side of the atheists. I'm working for Satan." He strongly implies I'm not a Christian. He directly says, "I don't think you believe in the second coming," which is just false. But he's spreading gossip on that, and spreading these like rumors that I might not, which is just ridiculous. So and then people got mad at me for my response back to him because I wrote a post on my YouTube channel. But most of the people who got mad at me didn't watch the video and didn't realize how incredibly condescending and rude he was.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so for me now, I am not going to do the reverse and accuse him of working on behalf of Satan because I'm not in that business, obviously. But that sword cuts both ways. One could say that Kent, in trying to divide Christians over secondary issues like evolution, like, don't you think Satan wants us dividing over secondary issues? Like, I think so. That sword cuts both ways. I don't think it was appropriate, his response, and it definitely turned me off of him big time. That wasn't a bad impression of him, by the way, that you just did. That was quite good.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I guess we can jump right into it. Although I did have a guest I wanted to bring in here real quick. Hey, can you hand me that water on your way over? Thank you.
So Mike, you have a 4th grade reading, right?
I did read in 4th grade, yes, but I read after that as well.
Oh, you can't really see me.
You better scoot in here, son. Yes, don't let YouTube world, don't let your eyes deceive you. It is Stillman Smith Jr. and John Dunphy in the same room.
Do you guys both live in Pittsburgh?
Nope. But let's just say I drove 4.5 hours to take a vacation for the week because
just for you, Mike. So be flattered.
I mean, like, you could have gone somewhere nice instead of like Pittsburgh. I mean, but
Well,
you
you
better
know.
get a permane. You better get a permane sandwich while you're there.
Oh, that's actually true.
Well,
Yeah.
you better make sure that happens.
It's
All right,
the
so
rule.
Oh, sorry.
do you have anything you want to say before I get into this? Because actually, I'm going to try to steal man what I think could be.
Avoid Michael Jones. You avoid hermeneutics like taxes.
No, I do not avoid taxes because I don't want to go to jail. I've tried very hard. I tell my CPA, just make sure I'm not in trouble. I'll pay whatever.
Yeah.
Well, you do a 10K 99, right, for all the Patreon and stuff.
No, I no, that all goes to the 501c3, and then I pay myself a W-2. It's a weird setup, but I mean my CPA helped me with it, so we're all good.
Gotcha.
All right. So let's get into this. So the first problem, which I actually have numbered, so this is technically number 10 in the video, but I silly me numbered them just in chronological order. So number 1 is the idea of Abraham laughing because God tells me he's going to bear a child, and he's laughing in old age. And the reason this is a problem, and if you would like to present it better, you can. But as far as I understand, the reason this is a problem is because if the ages of the patriarchs were literal ages, like living to 900 and 800 and these kinds of things, and they were supposedly having children in these old ages, Abraham shouldn't have been surprised that God says he's going to bear a child when he's 100. So did you want to present it stronger than that?
Yeah, so the basic idea is that Abraham laughs at the prospect of having a child past the age of 100. Shall a man who is over 100 have a child? Shall Sarah, who is 90, have a child? Now, notice he doesn't say because Sarah is barren. That was a factor. But another factor was people in their old ages just didn't have children that old. And in fact, if you read in Genesis 18, God even implies that. When Sarah laughs, God says, the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? So he agrees. He implies that, yeah, this is something that's not going to happen natural. It's going to happen through me because people in these old ages just don't have children. So God even agrees with Abraham.
Okay, so one thing I might say, so according to the young earth view, obviously after the flood, ages start dropping off dramatically. And so what if someone said in response that, yes, okay, Abraham's father and his grandfather, and these people are kind of having kids maybe into their being 130 years old or 125 years old, but maybe we're getting down to Abraham now, ages are dropping dramatically, and he's looking at all his peers, and all his peers are maybe probably not having children at ages like 90 and 100.
Okay, well, that's just false. For example, just look at Abraham's grandson, Jacob. So if you do the math throughout that thing, Jacob was actually having kids after the age of 90, if the ages are literal. So, for example, if you do the simple math, like Jacob lived to 147, and he lived 17 years in Egypt. So he was 130 when he went to Egypt, according to Genesis 47. Joseph was 39 years old when this happened, because it says in Genesis 41 he was 30 when he entered the Pharaoh's service, and there were 7 years of plenty and 2 years of famine before before Jacob came down to be with Joseph. So you subtract 130 by 139. Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. That implies Benjamin was born even later because he was younger than Joseph. So Jacob would have been having children in very old ages. So that just sort of blows that theory out of the water. Jacob is able to have children past the age of 90 and close to 100. Why shouldn't Abraham, who's further back in the deterioration line? And plus, this is something Kent Hovind missed because he doesn't really study the Bible in a lot of ways, unfortunately. He claims he does, but I so many times I've watched him and go, oh my gosh, this is just bad.
That's because you don't use the Holy King James Version that Jesus spoke and read.
Right, yeah, because he spoke that.
That's when the scribes were sitting down, that's what they were writing in. No Greek, Aramaic, or Hebrew, or anything like that. So, yeah.
Well, let's just look at the King James. Ken Hovind replied and said, Terah was 70 when Abraham was born. Okay, that's wrong. He wasn't. The reason, and this has been pointed out by Answers in Genesis, Defending Inerrancy, a lot of young earth creationists have pointed this out. Why? Because Genesis 12 says Abraham left Haran. It implies that Abraham was 75 when he left Haran. Okay? And then if you read Acts 7 in the King James, it says, then he, Abraham, came out of the land of Chaldeans and dwelt in Charan. And from thence, when his father was dead, he was removed into the land wherein ye now dwell. So Acts 7 says Abram didn't leave Haran until his father died. His father died at 205. And Genesis 12 says he was 75. 205 minus 75 means Abram was 130, or Terah was 130 when Abraham was born. The passage Ken Hovind cited, Genesis 11:26, says Terah fathered Abram and his two brothers at 70. And most young earth creationists will say, well, that's when he started fathering children, but Abram was probably the youngest.
Yeah.
So they'll try that kind of thing.
Mm. Okay, and then so the second point on that, before we move to point 2, I should have made it into an overlay, but last minute prep is what kicks my butt every time. So I'm just going to read it off my phone here. So this is Genesis chapter 5, and skipping to verse 3, it says, when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So to me, if saying Adam lived to 930 years is symbolic, for whatever reason or purpose or motivation the biblical authors had for giving these old symbolic ages to the patriarchs, it just seems to me a very weird way to write it as though it's actual history. So, because if the number 930 isn't literal, then that means there's a couple of other non-literal numbers that are kind of forced into the text. So when it says Adam had lived 130 years, was he really 130 years when he had Seth? Or is that one symbolic too? And if that one's literal, then why just pick the number 800 and have that one added onto it? So it just seems that, the straightforward kind of historical reading where you have these different ages and then they're being added up instead of just a total being assigned at the end.
Well, one of the things they're doing is symbolic formulas. So if you add up all of the ages from Adam to Moses, you get 12,600. And that's a symbolic number for God. It's like an unfolding type purpose. You see another type of that number in Revelations. Like it's just a lesser form of it. It's not 12,000. It's like, can't remember exactly which one it was. It might be like 1260. But you see that number in other places in Scripture. And these type of formulas show up in Jewish works. So, for example, Demetrius fabricated ages in order to fit a predetermined value. He was an early writer. Polemus utilized patterns of 480 to coincide with the Maccabean liberation of Jerusalem. So he wanted these cycles of 480 leading up to the liberation. The Book of Jubilees condensed, ignored, and changed biblical chronologies to make Israel's history into a series of jubilees, 50 years. And, of course, the Gospel of Matthew changes generations, sometimes duplicates, to get 3 sets of 14 generations between Abraham and Jesus. This is just what they did in that culture. They changed ages, they used it for symbolic purposes, and they got different meanings out of those. If you check out my video on Genesis 5, I go into a lot more detail on this.
Okay. Yeah, no, definitely.
Can I bring up a point I find sort of inconsistent with young earth creationists? Why?
Sure.
I probably get in the shot. Why is it that death comes into the world at the fall, but yet somehow they live to 900, and then they ad hocly posit environment change, and then it drops down to 120? I just don't get that myself, because the perfect environment was already Genesis 2 in their view, because they're with God, and then obviously that breaks when they're cast out of the garden, and I just don't get the cool argument there unless they have to posit science not in biblical text.
They're claiming there was some canopy before the flood that sort of made living conditions better, and Ken Hovind would say the oxygen was increased. The problem is that there's no known physics that could keep a giant canopy above the earth. And even if there was, it would actually heat the earth because magnifying effects.
Well, fine-tuning as well. We need a certain amount of oxygen for us to even be on this planet. So that argument would affect that, what we know about fine-tuning as well, if there's more oxygen or whatnot.
Right. It would change the physics drastically. And if you look at even creation research, CRI, I think is what they are, they have wrestled with this conundrum a lot. And they talk about the flood would have to change laws of physics even, which just seems a little ad hoc to me. There's a lot of problems with it. And again, I would argue that the flood account fits just fine with a regional flood account, which we can get into later.
Well, no, that's actually a perfect segue, because point 9 or 2 is the text on the flood, pointing to the idea that it's probably regional, not global. So maybe, did you want to lay that point out?
Well, real quick, if you take man's word, then of course you agree with what science has to say.
Yeah. The early church fathers never said that nature was the 67th book of scripture, but
Second century Theophilus apologist, he most certainly didn't posit Genesis as being allegorical.
No.
They're all young Earth creationists.
Neither did Irenaeus. He said that each day was like 1,000 years, but whatever. So Genesis 8, I point out in this chapter that it fits far better with a regional flood model. Why? Well, it says in verse 5 that the tops of mountains were seen as the water was abating. However, skip down to verse 9. After Noah releases a dove, and it says, "But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned him in the ark. For the water on the face of the whole earth." Okay, well, wait a minute. I thought tops of the mountains were seen. If the water were still on the face of the whole earth, you can't have any land appearing. So, which is it? Well, most young Earth creationists and people who have responded to this will say, well, it just meant that they were, it doesn't mean literally every piece of land. Well, exactly. If the phrase whole earth doesn't mean every piece of land, go back to Genesis 7 and apply the same logic. It can fit with the very same logic there, that it was just a regional flood.
Yeah, and kind of on an unrelated note, but kind of with the similar idea, is Mike Winger did a video basically destroying this idea that the Bible teaches a flat earth. And that was one of the points he brought out, is he's like, you get a whole different ideas when you understand when the Bible uses the word earth. It can refer to many different things. It can refer to the globe, but it can also refer to just a big piece of land. It can refer even to the inhabitants of a big piece of land. And so that's a good point. So yeah, I actually don't have any disagreements with that, or even, as far as Steelman, trying to define the Steelman objection. It wouldn't be too that.
There's another good point. Later in Genesis, it says all of the earth came to buy grain from Joseph. Okay, does that mean the people in Mesoamerica came? Probably not. And we know not the whole earth came to buy grain from Joseph, because Jacob didn't go. He sent his sons to. So not everyone. Doesn't mean literally everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great point. So in the interest of trying to find, let's say, a hole in the kind of regional flood theory, what would you say to people who bring up the idea that when God hangs the rainbow in the sky, this is a promise not to flood the earth again? And if what the promise is merely not to do a regional flood, then that promise has been broken how many hundreds or thousands of times since?
Yeah, so he says he's going to hang his bow in the sky to never flood the earth again. But again, it says, so to quote it directly, it says, "I will establish my covenant with you, and never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." So again, that can easily fit with the regional hypothesis, because he's just talking about the general land there. And there hasn't been a flood of that great magnitude where the Persian Gulf flooded in and then flooded up the Mesopotamian area. So I talk about it in my video on biblical archaeology, where I cover the flood. The massive flood that would have flooded the whole region, that region hasn't been flooded in that way since then, and probably never will be again. That would have happened during the end of the Younger Dryas period, according to my hypothesis, when massive coastal flooding would have happened, and we've never seen anything like that again. Again, the language of Genesis 9 can fit exactly like the hyperbolic language we see in Genesis 7 and Genesis 8 about the flooding of the whole earth and all the mountains are covered, as well as with later in Genesis when it said all the earth came to buy grain from Joseph. We have to understand they can talk in this hyperbolic language, and young Earth creationists just can't pick and choose when it literally means the entire planet and when it doesn't mean the entire planet. But that's what they do. They'll take Genesis 8, 9, and they'll go, well, when it says the whole earth there, because mountains were seen, it doesn't mean the whole earth. But then they'll go to Genesis 9 and go, no, that has to mean the whole earth. Well, why? Why do you get to pick and choose?
Right, yeah, that's a good point. And then so point number 3.
So should Jefferson Yakitori respond to that point?
If you'd like to.
No, I'm kidding.
Okay. So then point number 3 is kind of the attack on the idea that they take all of Genesis 1 and 2 literally, and you even ask Kent in the debate you guys had if he takes all of Genesis 2 literally. And then you point out, though, but it talks about man and woman becoming one flesh, and that you can interpret that literally. And when Kenton's response to that, ironically, I think he gave you exactly what you wanted there, is he just said, yeah, maybe it does just mean the child, or maybe it is just symbolic of sexual intercourse or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I found it ironic that Kenton even acknowledged that he got caught in a trap there. I mean, he said he takes all of Genesis 2 literally. And when I pointed out you can't do that, he just moves on and pretends like that was never an issue. The problem is that, as I noted in my video on Genesis 2, this opens kind of the floodgates a little bit. Because if you start to study the Hebrew of Genesis 2, you're going to come and run into some issues. For example, it never says Eve was made from a rib in Hebrew. It says she was made from a selah. And selah means side. It would probably refer to the entire side of something. So did God like cut Adam in half and sew up the flesh and Adam was hopping around on one leg? Probably not. I mean, if you want to be ultra literal, when it says that Adam was put into a deep sleep, that same verb is used in other places in Scripture to prepare someone who's about to receive a heavenly vision. So Adam is put into a deep sleep, prepared for visions, and he sees that woman is the other side of him. Okay, so what's going on? If we're going to take it absolutely literal, you have to understand the whole rib episode is Adam receiving a vision because of that word for sleep that Adam is put into. And go even further in Genesis, further back, when it talks about Adam being made from dust, there is no Hebrew preposition in there for from or of. It just says Adam, dust of the earth, or man, dust of the earth. We add from in there because we think it belongs there. But you can read that just fine without interpreting that he was literally made from dust. So when Kent admitting this about Genesis 2:24, it opens the door to realize there could be other metaphors in the passage. I think Eve being made from a whole side is another metaphor.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's a great point. And I actually really don't have anything to come back on that one. So point 4, and actually maybe this one you could explain to me a little bit better, because when I saw it, I wasn't actually quite sure how it posed a challenge for the young earth view, even if just accepted wholesale. So point 4 was the idea that young earthers would teach that man was kind of immortal until he sinned and then death came into the world. But then you pointed out that it was probably just the tree of life that what it was keeping them immortal, that they weren't, say, quite literally have like an indestructible body or something that couldn't be killed, but it was because they had access to the tree of life that essentially allowed them access to immortality, so to speak. So maybe you could expound on that a little bit more and why that poses a challenge to the young earth view.
Yeah, well, what they'll say is something like the idea that, God said when he made everything, it was very good, and so it had to be perfect. I talk about that in my video, I believe in Genesis 2, or maybe it's 1b, where I talk about that probably refers to functioning properly, not necessarily perfect.
Right.
But so they want to say that, humans were sort of immortal before the fall. There was no death. They could have just kept living and then nothing would have died, kind of thing. Well, I mean, the implication in Genesis 3 is that, God never actually changes their bodies. He says the ground is cursed because of you, and he just banishes them from the garden, and then they die later on. Or it's at least assumed. With like Eve, for example, someone I think commented on my video said, well, Eve never died. And I was like, okay, so what? Because the Bible never says she died, kind of thing, which I found a little interesting. It was his idea.
Yeah. Where is she?
Yeah. But all God says is, I'm just not going to let him eat from the tree of life anymore, because if he does, he'll live forever. So that implies they were mortal humans, and the only way they got immortality was from eating from the tree of life. So there was mortality before the fall. And that also implies there probably could have been death before the fall. And I believe one of the other passages I bring up later reinforces that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess just when I saw, because I have heard some young earthers kind of concede that point too, and to an extent, where they say, well, yeah, it didn't have to be perfect. They'll even say it says very good. It doesn't say perfect.
Yeah, but here's what they'll do. They'll go to Romans 5, and they love going here. They go there all the time. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and death spread to all men because all sinned. And then they stop, and they don't read any more. But if you get to verse 14, it says, yet death reigned from Adam to Moses. Are we talking about physical death here? Probably not. Later it says in the chapter that, Jesus Christ gave us life. Okay, it's not talking about physical life, it's spiritual life. So, as I pointed out, Romans 5 is more likely about spiritual life and death. It's not saying that physical death was somehow spread when sin happened. What happened was spiritual death, and then that was restored with the covenant via Moses, and then with the new covenant with Christ.
Okay. And then so now point 5 is kind of your response to the idea that chapter 2 is a recap of chapter 1. And here if I'm going to try to steelman the kind of an overall response to say all 10 points, I might try to say, okay, if I take all 10 points as a whole, I might say they don't actually pose a problem for young earth creationism. What they do is they pose a problem for maybe entailments that young earth creationists build on top of the young earth model. And I think this might be a good example, because if I found myself inclined to take the young earth view, I don't think I would be inclined to think that Genesis 2 is a recap of 1, right? I think I could say, yeah, the earth is only 6,000 years old. God created generic humanity in chapter 1 as his image. And then in chapter 2, which just isn't very long after, he creates Adam and Eve specifically to serve as representatives, mainly for the bloodline leading to Christ. So maybe, I guess, what would you say to that specific point, and then as the whole, as it being more an attack on entailments of the young earth view?
Well, right. The video is the top 10 biblical problems. I wouldn't say it's absolutely debunking the whole thing. It's just these are problems they have to wrestle with when they're building the young earth model. To give a reply I got from this, basically what I'm pointing out is the Toledoth of Genesis 2:4 implies a sequel. That's how it's used throughout Genesis. It always implies what comes after that person. So if Adam and Eve don't come until after the Toledoth, it implies they came after all the humans made in God's images of Genesis 1:28. So they come next after humans. That implies they weren't necessarily the first humans. Now, young earthers can function with that. I'm not saying it completely debunks it. It's just another problem they have to wrestle with and deal with. What I get with is to them to support this recap idea. So they'll go to verse 5, where it says, when no bush of the field was yet in the land and no small plant was of the field had yet sprung up. So they'll say, well, no, this has to be a recap because he's noting there wasn't any plants yet. But as scholars like Walton have pointed out, these are qualified. The way this phrase shows up later in the Hebrew Bible, these are cultivated plants, a bush of the field, small plant of the field. It's saying that God had not cultivated this land yet. Well, what happens after this? He plants a garden. So it gets cultivated. It says, look, here you have Genesis 1 talking about turning the whole cosmos into the temple. Then God hones in on the land of Eden and establishes sacred space where humans can meet with him. Well, this land is still wild and untamed. It's not been cultivated. Here, I'm going to plant a garden there. I mean, it's verse 5 is setting up so that God can plant the garden there. It's not talking about there's just no plants in existence yet.
Yeah, okay, definitely. And then point 6, and I apologize, I don't have the exact verses but you obviously you got it already in your head because quite smart. So point 6 is the idea that Genesis doesn't have to be literal material creation. And
this is Jeremiah. This is where I went to Jeremiah 4:23 to 26.
Okay, yeah. So maybe we can elaborate that, because again, as far as just maybe saying if the young earthers were to adapt all these points, they might just say, okay, but maybe material creation could have been 1 minute before the verse or 1 year before the verse. It doesn't necessarily have to add a whole ton of age.
Yeah. So what they'll say is that Genesis 1 is pretty clear. God made everything on this day, then that day. And you old earth creationists, you theistic evolutionists, you have to metaphorically interpret this. You can't take it literal. Okay, but luckily the prophet Jeremiah comes to the old earth creationist aid here, because he takes the same language in Jeremiah chapter 4, and he uses it for a metaphorical explanation of what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel. He uses the phrase tohu and bohu, formless and void, to describe them. He says there's no light, there's no birds of the air, there's no manna there. It's no longer fruitful. So reverse of day 3. And so what I'm just basically pointing out is, look, this language is used to describe a kingdom going from functioning to not functioning. If the reverse is happening in Genesis 1, you could just say the same thing. God is taking a universe that's not functioning properly, and he's making it function properly according to his needs and for how humans will use it within their civilizations.
And so I guess I would ask, like, what's the I guess like the main relevant point here, because obviously we would all as Christians agree that matter isn't eternal, right? So even if, let's say, that Genesis itself isn't describing literal material creation, that God did literally create all the materials, and so why not necessarily assign it to that verse? What would be kind of the purpose in separating it?
Well, we have to get into we have to try to understand the ancient cultural context of the Bible. Now, in the New Testament, there are places where it says God made all things, like John chapter 1. It's also in Colossians, so no problem there. I believe it's also in Proverbs. So no issue there. We agree God made all things. The authors of Genesis 1 were not interested in those kind of questions. They were responding in a lot of ways to the pagans of their days who believed that their gods were sort of reigning supreme. And so they're saying, no, it's really Yahweh who controls everything. And he orders and structures the cosmos. He controls fertility. It's not Ishtar. He speaks things into existence. It's not your god Marduk who sort of has to rearrange matter that's already there. Yahweh sort of can control everything with just speaking it. He's way better. So that's what they're trying to say there. We have to understand that's the context of Genesis 1. And so there was a debate among scholars. Some scholars think there is implicit attacks on pagan gods. Some say it's just not really there. You're reading that into the text. So there's an interesting debate going on there with regards to, are there directly implicit attacks, or are we just putting them in there? But nonetheless, the point of what they're trying to say is Yahweh reigns supreme.
So with Moses writing the Pentateuch, if you argue for the authorship of Moses with the Pentateuch, I think you could argue that, Mike, because if you look at the 10 plagues, they do attack 10 specific Egyptian deities, which is quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you could make that implicit argument that, yeah, Moses probably is attacking other pagan gods around.
Yeah, and let's on a side note here, when people try to, like, I forget who it was, but someone brought up Michael Heiser talking about, the Old Testament mentions all sorts of other gods in existence. Yes. The Christian, we acknowledge there are other Elohim. What a lot of skeptics do is they equate the biblical word Elohim with our English word God. And that's not really fair, because when we talk about God, we talk about an eternal creator who brought all matter into existence. In the ancient biblical world, Elohim just meant a spiritual entity. So Samuel is called an Elohim at one point when Saul tries to go to the necromancer. Angels can be, created spiritual entities can be referred to as Elohim. So yeah, they believed in all sorts of Elohim. The Bible does acknowledge the Elohim of Egypt are there. They just say there are these lesser rebellious spirits, like Satan, for example. So yeah, there's no problem there in them acknowledging the existence of these other Elohim. They just don't think of them like we think of the gods with our English word for God. So there's a distinction there. And if anyone wants more, you can see my video on polytheism in the Bible, where I address that in detail.
Word salad.
Not to go off on a side trail, but Mike Winger and Tim Barnett both recently did a video responding to this long Twitter thread of 10 debunkings of the Bible. I'm sure you saw it. And one of the ones is when it says God is jealous of other gods, that's admitting other gods exist. And so
yeah. Is admitting other Elohim exists. So what? We know. Move on.
Yeah. No. Okay. So yes. What was the next? Okay. So yes. Point 7. And so maybe you can unpack this. And this is the idea that young Earth creationists don't believe the sun and the moon were created till day 4, but clearly we have days occurring before day 4. So there has to be a problem there.
Yeah. This is one of the oldest arguments against young Earth creationism. Is why does the sun and moon not come in until day 4? I would say there's probably some sort of framework going in there. Day 1 and day 4 correlate. You have the light on day 1. You have the luminaries on day 4. Then on day 2, you have the sun in the sky. You have the animals that fill them on day 5. And the same with day 3 and day 6. There's a framework kind of going on there in that kind of sense. So what we point out is that on day 4 is that's when you first get the luminaries that are going to give heat and light, create photosynthesis so the plants can grow. That are created on day 3. There's a problem there. So young Earth creationists will take 2 routes. The first thing they'll do is they'll say, well, maybe God created another light source, and then he gathered that light together into the sun, which just kind of seems weird. That's not how the moon was created, by merging light together. The moon is just reflecting the light of the sun. So problem there. What they'll also say is, no, well, God was the light. He was the light that was lighting for all the planets and until he created the luminaries. Okay, there's another problem there. Just read Genesis 1. God said, let there be light. In verse 2, God is hovering, or the wind of God is hovering over the face of the waters, and there's no light yet. So God sort of, if you have to take it literally, absolutely literally, and not like Jeremiah takes it, but absolutely literally, God has to somehow then create light. be there. And if it's light, if the light of God in Revelation says the light of God would light everything, there would not be any night or day or any of those types of things. So God is like a light somehow in like the center of the solar system, and then he like on day 4 decides to just leave and put a sun there instead. Like, it's just, you get these really weird, convoluted, ad hoc ways to get around the fact that the sun and the moon don't come till day 4. I think if you incorporate, maybe there's some sort of literary framework going on in Genesis, like I mentioned earlier, there's no issue. But no, if you got to take them absolutely literal days, you're going to run into that kind of problem. So a lot of the young Earth responses just get totally ad hoc in how they try to get around that.
Mm-hmm. So what if the young earthers said in response something like, aha, but you just admitted what I wanted you to admit, which is that what we're talking about here is 24-hour days, because essentially what you're trying to make a defense of is saying, well, you needed the sun and the moon prior to day 4, because otherwise you can't have an Earth rotation to get you a literal 24-hour day. So you're admitting what we want you to, which is the literal 24-hour days.
Yeah. This is one of the funny things to me is I get a lot of comments on that video talking about that, saying like, well, you deny there's 7 literal days. And they'll bring up Exodus 20:11, which they love to go to. No, my view is the temple inauguration view, the view of John Walton, the view of Robert E. Homestead, that there are 7 days in Genesis, but it's not, and they can be seen as 7 literal days. But it's just simply the idea that this is God inaugurating the cosmos to be his temple. That's why it's 7 days, because 7 is a sacred number in the Hebrew scriptures. So again, no issue there. I take the 7 days to be literal. I just don't think it's about material manufacturing of everything or bringing everything into existence.
Do you think 7? Oh, sorry. Do you think 7 is God's lucky number when he's gambling?
God doesn't gamble. John.
Open theism. I mean,
yeah. Well, I mean, look at what God says on day 4. He says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for the signs and seasons and for the days and the years." Okay, God really is telling us right there. He's assigning them functions. They're for the signs and for the seasons. Okay, yeah. Right then and there, you see the assigning of functions, not necessarily material manufacturing.
Yeah, and that seems reasonable to me. And so I guess the last question on this would be, do you think the young earthers could incorporate that into their view to say, okay, when God says, say, let there be light, he creates the sun. And then it's just, so you have little 24-hour days and still 6,000 years. And it's just not till day 4 that those things are assigned the specific functions to say serve as signs for us to look to measure days by.
Yeah, I think that would be fine. But now you have a weird issue where on all these other days, God is manufacturing everything. But on day 4, he's just assigning functions. It's like, again, it's not, these don't necessarily debunk young earth creationism. These are just biblical problems for them. And so my point is they have these ad hoc explanations. They have to add assumptions to the text, which they say when we do it, we're adding to the word of God. But when they do it, they're just interpreting and trying to help better understand. So there's a double standard there.
Yeah. I think for me, when I was just initially kind of going through Genesis and trying to just figure out, granted, this is one of the reasons I want to learn Hebrew, right? Because there's only so far I can go studying the English text here. But one of the things that just struck me was that it says very specifically before the 4th day, he separated the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And I'm thinking, okay, well then, like, what specifically is that? Like you said, one of the things they try to say to get around it is God was the light, but then so is God only existing on half of the earth? And then I don't know, it was just weird to me as I read it. So yeah.
It's very weird. And again, one of my biggest things is let's try to understand it in the ancient cultural context. That's why I have a series on my channel, The Cultural Context of the Biblical World. And there's 4 videos in there right now where I'm trying to help people say, hey, let's try to understand these texts in their cultural context. That's going to help us better understand them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then Genesis 1:28. And so this is where God tells Adam and Eve to subdue the earth. And you make a good point here that subdue isn't, say, merely just planting things nicely and peacefully. That is actually a quite harsh word. So maybe you could expand on that some more.
Yeah, so this comes from the scholar Joshua John Van E, who wrote a really great paper called Death and the Garden. And he's basically pointing out there's death is already implied in Genesis 1. It's not something that was sort of introduced after the fall kind of thing. And he goes through Genesis 9. Which we can talk a little bit about if you want. But basically, the verse is God tells humans to subdue the earth and have dominion over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, and all the animals. Now, these are very harsh words. The word subdue is used of war, conquest, and enslavement. This is not something you would talk about when you're just saying, just be great stewards of the planet I've already created. It's perfect. No, this is God saying, things are chaotic out there, and I have elected you to help me bring order to this world in that kind of sense. This will relate to a video I'm going to do in June on the problem of suffering. So that'll come out later, which I'm still working and writing. But it's mainly the idea that God sort of sets up a world, and he's a relational being. So he wants creatures to work through him to make something better. And that's what the earth is. Eventually, it will be a paradise. That's why I'm a post-millennialist. But it's just he wants to make it a paradise through humans. And so that also relates to what we see in Romans 8 as well, with creation groaning for the corruption to be thrown off. So these words are very harsh. The word for dominion or rule is not used of someone unless if someone is ruling over them with oppression or injustice, or with a total strong iron force, like unbreakable, like control kind of thing. So these are basically God is giving animals to humans to use them however they please. He's saying the earth needs subdued, and I'm going to give you animals that can for the use of that. So use them however you need for food, clothing, tools, whatever it is. So it's very harsh. God is basically giving him animals for their full use. And if you go to Genesis 9, we see that as well. In fact, it was Philo of Alexandria that said Genesis 9 is just a restatement of the covenant of Genesis 1.
Okay. So now here's a question is like, how harsh does it have to be? Because again, going back to the idea of, let's suppose young earthers wanted to take these points at face value and just incorporate them into the worldview. It's still this idea of, well, the creation didn't have to be perfect, it just had to be very good. And maybe, so let's say the garden was far superior, it was very good and even much better than the rest of the planet. So even the rest of the planet outside the garden was, say, good, but maybe harsh to an extent. And so they had to kind of subdue it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine, but then it's going to throw a stone in their gears about how God created everything perfect and there was no death or there was no pain or suffering before that, which is fine. But now they have to modify the typical young earth model they're always promoting.
Right.
So, sorry.
I was going to go into Genesis 9, but you go ahead first.
I was just going to say, I find it interesting that prior to the fall, man was immortal, but like, would this mean they had resurrected bodies like Jesus and that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15? I think the answer should be an obvious no, but.
Well, that's another thing Joshua John Van E brings up. He, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is comparing our bodies, the bodies we have in Adam, versus the body of Christ. Okay, well, he says the bodies, the body of Adam has is corruptible, it's good, it's going to perish, it needs to be changed. And Joshua John Van E notes, Paul is implying that Adam had a mortal body like us, and it needed to be changed into a resurrected body. That's why he needed the tree of life to stay immortal, because his body was not a resurrected body.
So yeah, then so point 9 is the Hebrew word bara.
Well, let me address Genesis 9 first, because I know you're bringing this up. Yeah, well, they'll say that animals were not given as meat until Genesis 9. The problem is that Joshua John Van E notes there's no temporal indicators in the Hebrew. So when God is giving them plants, he's also giving them meat. Translators imply temporal indicators that this is the first time they're allowed to eat meat. Problem, of course, is that go back to Abel, for example. Abel brought the fat of his flock. So what, did he just kill the animals, let the meat rot, and bring the fat of his flock, the tallow, for God as an offering? Well, no, it's probably left over from eating of the meat kind of thing. And in this Genesis 9, it's just a restatement of the covenant of what you got in Genesis 1. The difference is that it says the fear and dread of all the animals will be upon you. That's actually a restatement of Genesis 1:28, just from the animal perspective. Because fear and dread means you can have dominion. It's used throughout the Hebrew Bible to refer to dominion over someone. Like when you step upon the land of Canaan, the fear and dread of the land, the fear and dread of you shall be upon the land. It's like an idiomatic way to say that you're going to have dominion over it. So it's just a restatement of what we already have in Genesis 1, but from Genesis 9, it's said from the perspective of animals in that idiomatic phrase.
And as Dan Barker would say, if we need you to explain all this to us, if we can't just read it for ourselves and get it, God must be inept and unable to just communicate his word to us clearly.
Word salad.
Yeah, I mean, which is a bad argument, because God throughout the Bible, it's about soul building, growing us into mature, intelligent creatures. And you can't do that just by spoon feeding us everything. God wants us to study the word and learn things. And I don't understand why the atheists will make this claim, because they obviously don't understand the nature of the soul-building theodicy and what God is actually trying to do. He wants you to grow in knowledge. He doesn't want you to be a baby forever.
But see, you can sufficiently explain the interpretation of the text with naturalistic pantheism, like so.
Yeah. It's a good one.
It's a pinhole. Yeah, no, it's funny. I just if people haven't seen it, I would point them to the debate that Dan Barker recently had with Randall Rouser on capturing Christianity. I thought Randall did such an excellent job attacking Dan's points and pointing out that, yeah, when God wrote his word, he didn't want it to be kind of like an escape plan for a hotel in case there's a fire. Like, it's just kind of real bland and just easy. Everyone can get it, but then it's not very deep. Like, it's not very meaningful if it's not deep. And so there's a value in us debating. There's a value in us pursuing deeper answers. There's a value in like debating evolution and if that's compatible with Genesis. I really believe that. And Jordan Peterson makes the argument that where meaning is to be found is in balancing that balance of order and chaos, where like enough about it, so we know enough about the essentials, right? The Trinity, Jesus, the incarnation, those kinds of things. But then the secondary issues is where, so you got the balance of order, so that's where things are known, but then you have the unknown, which is where we're debating these things. And so I do, and he says scientifically, that's where meaning is to be found. And then so I think that just fits nicely with the argument Randall made there. So, but I apologize for that tangent. So point 9 is the Hebrew word bara, where this doesn't have to mean, did I say it wrong?
No, you said it right. Yeah.
Okay. This doesn't have to mean creation out of nothing. And then, so is this similar to point 6, where Genesis doesn't have to be talking about material creation?
Yeah, it's related to when I went over the passage with regards to Jeremiah 4. But the basic point is something that bothered me when I was being raised in a young Earth creationist church, and which eventually caused me to leave Christianity for a little while, was that I was always told bara means God is creating out of nothing. Well, that's just false. It's used throughout the Bible for even humans doing stuff. Like at one point, it's used of David eating food in 2 Samuel 12. The word bara is in there. So it's like, okay, it's has a wide variety of meanings. In some ways, it could function like the English word create. We could say God created all matter, but we could also say, I create a safe environment for my family. An artist creates a beautiful work of art. Some people create meaning in their lives. It's used for such a wide variety of uses. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying bara could never mean creation of nothing. It could never mean material manufacturing. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's very rarely used that in the Bible, if at all. There's no definitive place in the Bible where it definitely is used to mean material manufacturing or creating out of nothing. John Walton goes through a lot of this.
Aristotle's 4 causes don't come about until the time of Aristotle, which is like 800, 900 years afterwards. So the metaphysical questions aren't really popular yet.
No, they weren't. And you're absolutely right. They were not popular before Aristotle. People in the ancient Near East were more interested in functions, processes, purposes, not so much in where space, time, and matter came from or when it came into existence. They just didn't ask those kind of questions.
Mike, when you get to 200,000 subscribers, are you going to go bald for your audience?
No.
No? Okay.
No. Do you want to like,
Hey, listen. No, I'm not going there. Okay, now I have to say, because now it sounds like I was going to make a dumb cancer joke, and obviously I wasn't going to go there. I was just going to point out that I am quite the bald head. That looks way weirder on camera.
Braxton Hunter is very jealous, Stillman.
Yeah, well, hey, listen, my grandmother told me that God made a few perfect heads, and he covered the rest with hair. So, Braxton Hunter and Tim Stratton and me, we can take that as we will.
That's where the hair goes. Ex nihilo, bara.
That sounds like she's just saying, bless your heart.
Yeah, yes. Yes. So the last point, so point 1 in the video, point 10 I have here, is the very first verse, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And you point out that in the Hebrew, it doesn't necessarily translate to in the beginning, but when. So maybe you could explain that more.
Yeah, so this is something that it's very difficult for people to accept, because Genesis 1:1 is a very famous verse. And there are people who argue that it should be in the beginning. Ironically, some people, when I posted the video, replied in the comments, they went and they just grabbed the Hebrew and they said, see, there's a definite article there. No, there's not. They showed me like the actual the very first Hebrew consonant there has 2 dots under it. If it was a definite article, it should be something that looks like a little T. So no, it's not a definite article in there. So the point is that there is no definite article there. So there's no word you would translate as the. And as you know, a lot of scholars, like for example, Robert Alter, who spent his whole life, not his whole life, but years working on a Hebrew translation of the Bible, he opens it up with when God began to create the heavens and the earth. He acknowledges that it should most likely be when. Robert E. Holmstead has written extensively on the syntax of Genesis 1:1. Notes also as well, this really should be understood as when God began to create. Now you might think, so what? But think of what that implies. If I told you in the morning I woke up, that's a complete sentence. But if I told you when I woke up, okay, that you're expecting something more. When I woke up, what happened? Likewise, Genesis 1:1, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was already formless and void. So it was already there. It was there, formless and void, or chaotic, waiting for God to sort of give it better functions, to sort of transfer the chaotic wilderness into an area that humans could thrive in, kind of thing. So that's kind of what you're kind of getting there. And so it's very hard for young earth creationists to, I guess, deal with that, because they very want that definite point beginning. But again, ancient people didn't really care about that. They didn't think those kind of things.
Now, would you say that in order for this point to go through, it kind of relies on point 9 when we're talking about the Hebrew word bara, not necessarily entailing creation out of nothing? Because I think what you said when we were talking about that last point was that it could mean creation out of nothing, but it doesn't have to. And one could say that if it does mean creation out of nothing, that says when God began to bara, if that's creation, it might as well say in the beginning, right? Because if that's the creation out of nothing, and that's the moment it occurs, and nothing was prior to that, no time, space, or matter, then saying when or in the beginning wouldn't make that big a difference.
Yeah, well, the problem is that you don't have a beginning point. And if God says when God began to create, it implies time was already there, kind of thing. So it doesn't really work for the beginning point translation. So yeah, and what a lot of responses to this will be is like, you know, that they'll try to argue that the syntax could be, now this is a little technical and complicated from what I've read, like AIG responding to this. They'll argue that the syntax is constrained to get the indefinite article reading. The reply to that, as like scholars like Ben Stanhope have noted, is that not necessarily, especially if you're talking about how you would use an opening formulaic structure for creation or narratives like this. So you want to start with like a dependent clause, followed by a circumstantial clause, followed by the main clause. If you take the definite reading of Genesis 1:1, you don't have that. You don't start with the dependent clause. Genesis 2:4 opens up with the same structure: dependent clause, circumstantial, main clause. The Enuma Elish does. Assyrian tablets that are, you know, sort of making their own versions of the Enuma Elish do as well as the Atrahasis. They always start with the standard ancient Near Eastern beginning: dependent clause, circumstantial clause, main clause. If you force if you force it to say in the beginning, you remove that, and so you pull it out of its cultural context, which doesn't really fit that well. So sure, the Hebrew would be constrained if it was being used elsewhere, but with regards to opening a creation narrative, this would be the standard way to do it.
Okay. And then so I guess just kind of to wrap this all up, and that this is why I like doing these kinds of discussions on. I had Hugh Ross on, when I had Joshua Swamidas on. Regardless,
all heretics.
Yes. Regardless of where I fall, because I admit I'm fairly agnostic when it comes to some of this stuff. I don't have a definite set view. Like I sometimes, some days I feel closer to Hugh Ross, some days I feel closer to you, you know. But one of the reasons I like these discussions is because, you know, I've had a friend who kind of introduced me to a mutual person that we were all talking to, and he was a Christian who was really starting to doubt Genesis because he had been told there's only one way to read it, the young earth view, and he was beginning to doubt that and thinking, well, now I just have to throw out the whole Bible. And so I just think there's such a value in showing people that there isn't only one way that you can read it. And so I guess, and I tried telling him that, and he just keeps saying, no, that's just word salads. That's just people trying to find excuses to justify the Bible when they know it's clearly false. So I guess if someone kind of makes that claim that, hey, listen, Genesis is pretty clear, you just have to do word salads to hold on to your Christianity, what would be your response to that?
My response is you're just looking for an excuse at that point. What does that mean? When people use that word, that phrase word salad, it really is often used in the context of they're just trying to think of a quick response without going into much thinking. And my typical response is, okay, but you're reading an English translation. You're not reading the Hebrew. You're not reading it with that cultural context in mind. You're reading an English translation with your cultural context in mind. And you need to take off both of those lenses, try to understand the Hebrew as best as we can, and try to understand the culture as best as we can, and then read it in that, and then see if it's word salad, see if my interpretation comes across like that. Because you will start to see that there's a lot of things that line up with the cultural context, like I've been going over throughout this hangout. So I don't really spend a lot of time when people say that kind of thing, because I'm really more interested in what scholars have to say about this, what evidence they're using and whatnot. I mean, let's at least try to be fair and let the Bible be what it is. Let's read it in its cultural context. Let's not try to force our understanding upon it.
Well, I guess that's the problem, is if you care more about what scholars have to say than what God has to say, then, at least, this is what Ken Hovind would latch on to at this point in time.
I can't wait for him to respond, because I guarantee you they're going to be pretty bad. And a lot of the objections I suspect he will use, I've already thought of, because preparing for this video, I'm thinking, well, how would they say this? Well, they'll probably try that kind of thing, or they'll try that kind of thing. Like with the first one, with Genesis 17:17, they'll probably bring up Genesis 25. And there's an easy way to get around that as well.
Yeah.
If you use mental gymnastics and hoops, then sure.
Yeah, that's what they always say, yeah.
Yeah. And two, Kent's response, I think, just shows like such an unfamiliarity with your views, right, and the complexity of them, because like he just takes a very generic thing, and you and I were talking kind of before about how he's somehow making you out to be somehow not really a Christian. You're trying to justify some kind of sin, and you pointed out that like it's because if someone claims to believe in evolution, then somehow morality must be out the window because we got here by random processes. When no, if he knew your view is that evolution, if you listen to your TEDx talk, for example, that there was specific fine-tuning that guided evolution in a certain direction. And so God can still instantiate the morals he wants to. And as long as we're all followers of Jesus, we should be adhering to the same morality.
I want my own TED Talk.
Well, you got to work hard. And they want you to try to memorize as much as you can of that. That was a problem. I didn't realize that till like the day before. And so I was like the night before in the hotel, I was trying to memorize as much of it as I could. But they did have like a little TV off to the side I could use as a reference. But yeah, you're right. I feel like a lot of young Earth creationists equate evolution, the theory of evolution, what they think evolution is. Yeah, Darwin. Even though we've built so much upon Darwin at this point, it'd be just absurd to assume evolution is just Darwin's theory. But they will equate that with naturalism, and a lot of the problems they have is really with naturalism or nihilism, not so much with the theory of evolution. You can have a theory of evolution that's completely compatible with theism and Christianity. Joshua Rasmussen and Jordan Westling wrote a paper called Reasons for Randomness, a solution to the axiological problems for theists. And what they point out in this paper is they point out extensively that a long process, a theory of sorry, I think I referenced the wrong paper. I meant to say the randomness-based theodicy for evolutionary evils. The other one kind of supports it a little bit, but this is the main paper I would recommend. They point out that the evolutionary history of the chaos and the suffering can be very compatible with a Christian worldview. And they go into some pretty interesting points with regards to it. And so the idea that somehow evolution is just completely incompatible with Christianity is just absurd, and it shows you haven't really read a lot about what theistic evolutionists are claiming and saying.
Yeah. So at this point, we've been going for, it looks like, an hour. Do you have a couple minutes to do Q&A if the audience has any questions?
Yeah, let's do some Q&A. I'm fine with that.
All right. You've been paying attention to the chat. Did you see anything in there? Because if not,
there's a bunch of questions that are not related to young Earth creationism. So,
well, why don't you look? I want to address one thing we forgot to with regards to the Abraham thing. So look for questions, and I want to address this really quick. Okay. Young Earth creationists, in response to Abraham, thinking he could have a kid past the age of 100, they'll bring up Genesis 25, where Abraham took another wife. And then he had all these other children. And they'll say, well, see, after Sarah died, he took another wife. Problem. Read the whole chapter. It said that all these sons, these children of this other wife, it says in verse 6 that that Abraham sent them away, sent them east, away from his tent, so that Isaac could receive the blessing. Why would he do that? Well, there was a practice in the ancient Near East called primogeniture, where the oldest son got the inheritance and the other sons didn't get anything, unless you disowned the older sons. So that's kind of what Abraham is doing here. He's sending them away. He's giving them gifts so they survive and fine. But he wants his youngest son, Isaac, to really have the inheritance, to really be his line. So he sends all these other sons away. Now, if they had come after Sarah, they would have come after Isaac, and they would be younger. There'd be no reason to send them away. But he sends them away, implying they're actually older than Isaac. And they would likely have been born in between Ishmael and Isaac. So it's most like Genesis 25 is most likely like an appendix on the life of Abraham, just filling in some extra details about things that happened during his life. And he had this other wife who he had sons with, but he had to send them away so Isaac could get the inheritance. So it's just kind of a similar situation with Hagar and Ishmael. Abraham not being a very good guy, has other children, but he sends them away so that Isaac can have the inheritance kind of thing. This doesn't really support the idea these children came after Isaac and that Abraham was still having children in this very old age.
Right. John,
you ready for a real stumper, Michael Jones?
No, I sure am.
Does Mike think that bowling balls and whales are related?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's a bowling ball, a eukaryote.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, sure.
It's a multicellular organism.
What is it? What did Calvin say to me? It's like whales and bananas. Do you think they're related? Yes. Like, so what? Like, why is that such a crazy thing to you?
Yeah. I guess maybe to tag on, and I guess if we don't get a lot of questions in here, we'll close it out soon. So if you guys have questions, throw them in there. I guess one thing I noticed, because when I had Joshua Swamidas on, he pointed out that when God creates the animals, in fact, I should probably just pull it up so I can actually read it, but he pulls up and he calls them from the ground, and so that there's a way to look at that and understand that, even though it doesn't say that they're evolving in a certain period of time, if God's calling the animals to be created from the ground, that can easily be understood to be evolution. And then so after the interview, I went and I started looking at that, and I really saw Josh's point there. I thought, I think that's a really reasonable reading of the text. But then it does seem to me, and maybe I can find it here, that the text goes out of its way, though, to still distinguish that from the creation of humans in God's image. And so even if I would say, yeah, it seems reasonable that the rest of animals could evolve, it does seem humans are being unique, and maybe you could respond to that as I'm trying to look for my support here.
Well, I would point out to people that the Hebrew Michael Heiser has pointed out the Hebrew syntax of Genesis 1:28 very much is humans being elected to be God's image. It's not so much an initial creation point. This is when humans are elected to be God's image. So if you're going to take a literal reading of Genesis 1, that implies that humans had to be created before that so they could be elected. And the only other creation that happens before that is the creation of the land animals. Combine that with Ecclesiastes 3, which says man is just another beast of the field, or to what happens to the one also happens to the other. They both go to the same place kind of thing. Well, okay, then humans just came from the land animals then. So you could have something that is consistent with evolution right there in Genesis 1.
Okay. And then, well, no, I think you probably would have already responded to that earlier. I was going to say that maybe young Earth creationists could say that there's a danger because they might say a theme that keeps coming up is this idea that, no, that wasn't the initial creation, that was an election, or that wasn't the initial creation of the sun and stars, that wasn't a signing, or that wasn't the initial creation of material, but now there's a temple inauguration. And that might create problems because then it seems like we're just trying to make an argument that Yahweh isn't the initial creator. But I think you kind of already responded to that in saying, but that wasn't Moses' purpose. Moses' purpose was that, no, your gods didn't do any of that, my God did.
Right, and there are other places in the Bible, like Colossians 2, John 1, where it says God made all things. So not really sure why that would be a problem.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so it looks like we got a question here from Josh again. Are there any Jewish scholars that agree with IP on the cosmic temple interpretation?
Not that I know. It would just be the scholars I cited. I know Robert Homestead. I don't think he's a Jewish scholar, but he does know the Hebrew quite well. This is his view as well. I remember emailing him before my debate with I had up in Toronto back in February with Dr. Joe Boot. And yeah, he holds to this view because I was emailing him to just get some questions prepared for the debate. And this is also Walton's view. Tremper Longman, Walton's son, who's now a scholar, whose name unfortunately is escaping me right now. But yeah, it's a growing view among scholars, but I'm not sure if there's any specifically Jewish scholars because I just haven't looked.
Are there any Second Temple Jewish texts that may support your view, or would that be something you have to look more into?
That'd be something again. I don't. One of the things that N.T. Wright notes is there's not a lot of commentaries. There are some, but there's not a whole lot of commentaries on Adam and Eve and the things happening in Genesis with the Second Temple Jews. The Christians wrote far more about Adam in those chapters than the Jews did. The Jews, of course, did, but I mean, they didn't really focus too much on that. They were more focused on the end of their exile, the coming Messianic age, Israel's relation, Moses. They were more focused on their own national interests at that point, for the most part. And Adam represented more of like a time further back than that, further back than Moses.
We got some intense questioning here for IP. Tell us where they are. Now, at what point does John Walton's interpretation of Genesis does IP disagree on?
So him and I disagree on Genesis 1:1. He thinks it is in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. So I disagree with him on that. Him and I disagree a lot on Genesis 3 because I think that the serpent is a rebellious seraphim. He thinks it's some sort of other creature, just a chaos creature, but he doesn't go into a lot of details in his book. We agree a lot on Genesis 2. I think mostly it's going to be the Genesis 1 verse 1 issue. In fact, Walt and I disagree a lot after Genesis 2. When I get to Genesis 3, I'm more in agreement with Heiser, Kenneth Matthews, and some other scholars as well. So I'm not just parroting Walton's view in my videos. That's a big misconception. I can't think of anything right now off the top of my head, but I would go with that.
Well, Heiser is the one who purports to your view on Genesis 1:1.
Yeah, Heiser holds to that view. John Salmer, I'm not sure if he does. He does mention it in his book as a possibility. I can't remember exactly what his conclusion was, though. But I know Robert Homestead does, and yeah, the other scholars I've mentioned.
Is there an English version that contains the closest Hebrew translation to the actual Genesis narrative?
I would maybe Robert Alter's translation. There's no translation is perfect in my view, and I think
about King James.
Yeah, except the King James. A lot of it has to come to do with the fact that translators have to meet cultural needs. So remember when they changed John 3:16 from begotten son to one and only son, and it was literally a satanic coup to change the Bible over that one verse. Imagine if they did that with Genesis 1:1. There would be literally pitchforks and people coming out with their pitchforks and torches to go after the Bible translators. So Heiser notes this, that translators have to compromise sometimes with cultural standards of today. It's unfortunate. So I don't really think there is a perfect translation out there. That's why I recommend people read the scholarship on the issue.
Mm-hmm. So I guess on that, you may have just said it, but I apologize. I was looking at the comments, so I think I missed it if you did address this already. Why is it that nearly every English version has gotten the phrase in the beginning? Like, where did that came from if it's not there in the Hebrew?
Well, it comes from when English translators started working, that's the way they thought it should be. And the more we have understood Hebrew over the years, the less we actually think that. I mean, okay. You understand that when they were translating the King James, they had very few manuscripts to work with. There was manuscripts at the Vatican they couldn't even get a hold of. This is something James White has noted. So our understanding of Greek and Hebrew has grown exponentially since then.
I remember listening to your one podcast. I think it was actually last December. Not your podcast, but you're on with this one Catholic young earth creationist who was basically calling you a heretic. And you just kept tearing him apart. I like how you brought up the point there that we have more Hebrew text now to understand this because, prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we didn't know too much about the Hebrew and Jewish tradition on these texts, but now we do. So, so that supports your view more, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing we knew about the Essenes prior to that, I think, is the very little Josephus said. There may have been a couple references of them elsewhere, like in the Talmud, but most of it comes from what Josephus said. And now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, a wealth more of knowledge. Much more knowledge is what I'm trying to say.
Hold on, I saw two questions there. I think they're both from Josh. You can pick whichever one of those you want.
Oh, the second one looks like a troll question.
Okay.
Is the creation... No.
Sorry. Is the creation narrative the only piece of Hebraic literature that contains this kind of literature?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you could argue that Psalm 74 is also a creation text and has some interesting parallels. Some scholars like Heiser think Psalm 74 is even an older creation text than Genesis 1, which could very well be the case. Genesis 2, of course, has the same opening formulaic structure of what Genesis 1 does, which is the dependent, circumstantial, main clause issue. In terms of maybe literature outside of the biblical text, I haven't really looked. I was more or less focusing on the better ways to understand the Hebrew of Genesis versus looking for other places where they would do this. And also, if you remember, a lot of other Hebrew texts come in a much later period where they had a lot more constraints. Like the Book of Enoch is really constrained by Greek understanding of astronomy and mathematics. So they're going to have a different cultural world than what you had prior to that when Genesis was being written.
Okay, and I saw. Oh no, he already answered that one.
Oh, he answered this one.
Yeah, and you can put it up there in case you wanted to just add anything maybe you didn't say before. Because he asks, at what point does Keturah become Abraham's wife? Isn't it after Sarah's death? And you kind of talked about this earlier. And it's Mike saying that she gave him 6 sons after Ishmael, so that she was always in the picture.
Yeah, I think the way Genesis 25 is written is just sort of like an appendix, just covering some additional details with Abraham's life. If this wife came after Sarah, it's very odd that Abraham had to send these kids away so that Isaac could have the inheritance. Because if they were younger, it wouldn't matter. Isaac would just get the inheritance, being the oldest of them all. Ishmael already being sent away. So I think the point is that I don't know how to pronounce her name without probably butchering it, but Keturah probably came around the same time as Hagar. Abraham, being a very bad, someone we should look to for morality. Hopefully don't look to Abraham and act like him. Kind of, I think that's what the authors of Genesis are saying in one way or another. He has Hagar, and he also took a second wife to have kids. Trying to help God fulfill the promise. And then he gets, at the end of it all, he still gets Isaac. So he's got all these extra sons, and he sends them away with gifts so that the promise can go to Isaac.
Yeah, and it looks like, which one is that?
What got you to do an exhaustive study on how to take man's word over God's word?
What got IB to do an exhaustive study on this creation story? It's a good question. Genesis is always, and probably still is, my favorite book of the Bible. I've always been very interested in it. There's a lot of things in the opening chapters of Genesis that people have questions about. So I thought I would just do a whole series on it, trying to do my best to answer those questions with the limited data that we have. So I was originally just going to do Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And then the video on Genesis 2 did really well. So I was like, well, maybe I'll go up to 6. And then I just decided I'm going to do all of Genesis 1 to 11. And so that was just kind of the basic idea behind it, is that there's a lot of questions about this. The opening chapters of Genesis have been a stumbling block for a lot of people who want to accept Christianity but can't. So I thought I'd give it some explanation here to help people better understand what the authors are trying to get at.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I don't see any more.
This should probably be the last question.
Okay, yeah, this will be the last question. Considering the Hebraic meaning, does Adam and Eve have an actual name? And does this point that Adam and Eve were not real?
Well, no. I mean, the name Abraham is probably a Hebraized version of Abraham's original name, which was probably like Abaramu or something. I'm going to talk about that in my next video, which will be on Abraham. So, no, I don't really see that as an issue. They're probably just assigning these types of names to help support their theological messaging. Adam and Eve would probably have had different names. I don't think it would have been Adam and Eve because that just means man and life. And so they're using that to sort of just for theological messaging. What their names were, I mean, it could have been some very old Proto-Akkadian names would be my best guess. I wouldn't say Proto-Sumerian because I don't think, because my view is the Proto-Sumerians moved into the region at some point after the flood. And so, because the Sumerian language is unlike any of the other surrounding languages of that region, so they would have probably migrated in there from somewhere else. And so there's the old Akkadian would have probably a proto form of Canadian would probably have been the language when Adam and Eve had names. Lost to time, doesn't really matter. They're just focusing on they're just trying to focus on this was man that God established and his wife, who we're going to call life, kind of thing. Not a big issue, I would say.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here for this video. I want to thank Mike Jones for taking the time, brother, to come be here. I guess, do you have any closing thoughts before we go?
No, thank you for me being here.
You know what? No.
That's fair.
John, make sure he gets a Permane sandwich.
I don't think he's worthy of them. He doesn't even like the Pittsburgh Steelers, so.
Well, that's a problem. But you can also take him to Sarah's candy.
See, even Michael Jones agrees with me, so.
Yeah, I have to. I'm from Pittsburgh. You cannot curse the Steelers. That would be a very bad thing.
I only bleeped him out when he wore it on the hat. I put a censored button over it.
Yeah. But yeah, people can check out my Genesis 1 to 11 series for more details on this, as I say in the video. And I would recommend people go through that or study some of the sources I provide in that.
Yeah, and I'll be adding a link to those in the description. They're not in there right now. I'm gonna have to do it kind of after the fact. And yeah, if you're new here, like, subscribe, and you can always support this ministry at subscribestar.com/TOA. What is
JMD Apologetics 101
or can they support you, Mike?
Patreon? Huh?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were finished.
Oh yeah, no, that's one way. People can find links if they want to support what I do.
Yeah, and how can they support you, Mike?
Inspiringphilosophy.org, and there's a donate button there.
Awesome. So until next time, again, Mike Jones, thank you so much for being here, brother, and hope to do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.